Hello, my name is Dan Vo and I'm a museum curator. That means I go into collections and I look for the queer history, the queer heritage, the connections that can be made. And as part of LGBT Plus History Month, we're actually going to be working with the National Gallery Scotland in order to look at the work of Ray Harryhausen. I'm going to be sitting down with some academics and having a chat about Ray Harryhausen, Titan of cinema, and having a think about what his work and his films mean for LGBTQ plus audiences. And today I'm joined by John Johnston, who's going to introduce himself right now.
Hello, my name's John Johnston. I'm an Egyptologist, classicist, and cultural historian. I specialize in ancient Egyptian mortuary archaeology, the Hellenistic and Roman periods of Egyptian history, and also gender and sexuality in the ancient world. Most particularly, I look at the reception of the ancient world in modern popular culture. So in the process, I'm looking at cinema, television, literature, architecture, those sorts of things.
And I think cinema is going to be a very important part of what we talk about today. And John, I think you've got a bit of a soft spot for Ray Harryhausen.
Indeed, I grew up with Ray Harryhausen, essentially. The first film that I saw of his at the cinema was The Golden Voyage of Sinbad on first release. And it was stunning. I'd seen the trailers on television, but of course, there's nothing compared to actually seeing it on the cinema. John Philip Law was extraordinarily beautiful as Sinbad. I had seen little bits late at night with my parents on television. I'd seen little bits of Barbarella. So I'd seen John Philip Law as Pygar, this gorgeous angel. So then to see him as Sinbad was because he's quite different as Sinbad. But I know that he had a great deal of fun doing it. He grew up with the Arabian Nights tales and was very, very keen that he shouldn't be a typical American jock. He wanted it to be very different from playing cowboys or playing police officers. He wanted to bring something different to it, and I think he succeeds. He was very aware that he had to play it in a certain way because physically, he has these steely blue, he looks nothing at all as one would imagine Sinbad to look. And yet somehow he still carries it off with a great deal of panache. The villain was absolutely fascinating. He had a sort of Vincent Price quality, and I didn't know the villain at all. It would be only about 12 months before I would know the villain extraordinarily well, because of course he was Tom Baker and he became the Fourth Doctor in Doctor Who.
I mean, he's obviously had a huge impact on you, but let's have a talk about how he's had an impact on the wider cinema world and have a chat about what he means to the queer imagination and to queer film as well.
It's impossible to overestimate the influence of Ray Harryhausen. His films were, from the outset, fascinating dives into the imagination. He was able to create special effects that seemed almost impossible. He, of course, begins by being inspired by Willis O'Brien's work on King Kong when he's very young, and he goes home and he tries to do this himself. But in so doing, he brings an additional element to it. Unlike modern CGI, which is very effective and works extraordinarily well, his creatures are characterful. You can see that there is more than just a computer program operating there, that it is a man sitting alone for months and months and months, moving these little armatures one space at a time. It's extraordinary work, and the number of modern filmmakers who have been influenced by him is just incalculable. In terms of queer cinema, Ray Harryhausen sits at a very strange point because he is straight, he doesn't come with any sort of gay agenda, and yet the material that he's covering, by and large, so the films set in ancient Greece, the films set in the world of Sinbad, the fantastical Arabian Nights world, have a sort of queer coding to them. And I think one of the reasons is because we're dealing with large groups of men who are often at sea for long periods of time. They're comfortable in their own skins. They're comfortable being naked with each other. I mean, there's the scene early on in Jason and the Argonauts where Jason holds a competition to see who should join him on the voyage. And of course, in ancient Greece, the men would all have been naked. But as it is, because it's 1960s cinema, they're mainly wearing these little perizomai, little loincloths. And we know that they existed because we have evidence of them from the famous bull leapers from the palace at Minos in Crete. So there's an immediate sort of queer coding that runs through these films. The casting is also very important because some of the most beautiful men of the cinema of the periods were used to portray the heroes. And there's a certain degree to which I think the camera lingers a little longer than maybe it ought. In almost every one of Harryhausen's films where he has a beautiful leading man, there is a scene where a beautiful leading man is stripped to the waist. And it's not always entirely necessary according to the narrative. This is show for the sake of show.
You set him down, half naked, in a strange, despairing city.
Chance?
Nothing to do with chance, and you know it.
In many ways, you're talking about stories that are ancient. Jason, Perseus, Hercules. Sinbad's just old. What is it about these stories that still appeal to this day?
I think these stories are ingrained into us as a culture and across cultures. They're stories of excitement, they're stories of monsters, stories of betrayal, very often familial betrayal as well. So they're stories that are, in many respects, somewhat timeless, but they're also stories where people are traveling off together. So there's a camaraderie that develops. There's something, despite all of the terrors that people have to face, there is something very warm and appealing about the nature of these tales, something comforting. And of course, it's even more comforting if you're a young gay man looking at these beautiful men interacting together on the screen. And of course, cinema at its most basic level is about sexual attraction. That's why we have film stars. That's why film stars are used to sell perfumes and lipsticks. And there is a sexual element to cinema. And it's something that Ray Harryhausen's films exploit very, very well because it doesn't feel like exploitation. It feels like we are simply telling a story here. So part of it is down to the period during which the films are set and the costume choices that are made based on that period. And we have, after a terribly buttoned up Kerwin Matthews in The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, actually a man who is gay himself. We'll come on to that later. But it's a very American buttoned down performance. But as a direct result of that, we then have a slew of sword and sandals epics, the pepla as they're called, which are made in Italy, which utilize people like Steve Reeves, who was famous for his physique. He was a bodybuilder, not really an actor, but he looked amazing in a little tunic. And even goes so far as to be mentioned in a song in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So we have this slew of films which are made on variations of the same set, with variations of the same costumes, very often with the same leading men. And it's just an excuse to have the actors and actresses wearing very little, doing something vaguely interesting with a sort of classical background. Doesn't even need to be classical, because after they move through the Hercules films, we see them moving on to Samson and Goliath, so biblical epics, except that epics with a very small e.
Let's stay with Hercules for a moment, because he's interesting. There's a relationship in Jason and the Argonauts between Hercules and Hylas. Can you talk about that relationship, please?
We know from ancient Greek literature, ancient Greek mythology, that Hercules and Hylas had a relationship. There are varying reports about how closely bonded they were. Some refer to them as being lovers, others refer to them just as being devoted friends. We know that Hercules has a huge list, mythologically speaking, has a huge list of lovers, many of whom are men. And there's no problem. He is still, for the ancient Greeks, the epitome of what heroism is. And he's been through it all and come out the other side, and he eventually goes off to join the gods on Olympus. So he is the ultimate hero for the Greeks.
Hercules. Yes. Hercules?
Yes?
My name is Hylas. Like you, I came too late to compete in the games. But it occurs to me that if I can beat you at something, Jason couldn't refuse me a place in his ship either. After all, he might need brains as well as brawn. Shall we compete?
What Harryhausen's film does is we see the meeting of the men, which is quite different to the literary meeting of the men. We see the meeting of the men, and it is very much a case of brains versus brawns, and it's very neatly introduced. Nigel Green was, I think, about 4 years older than John Kearney. John Kearney, I'm delighted to say, is still with us. And I've seen him on stage playing Robert Burns, one of the great roles of his career. They have a nice, easy interaction together. It's clear without any subtle eye movements or hand hold that they have a close bond. And the fact that Hercules leaves the film and remains on the island of Talos after Hylas' death speaks entirely to the nature of the relationship. And this also ties in with what we know of the mythological Hylas, who is dragged into the water by water nymphs, and Hercules goes off and spends years looking for his lost love. So there are definite similarities with what we know from the real world of the ancient Greeks, or the mythological world of the ancient Greeks. And it's sketched in just the broadest of details with a very light brush, but it works extraordinarily well. And they seem to have a very easy relationship with each other. And one wonders just how far that goes in the filmmakers' minds, and perhaps more importantly, in the minds of the audience. Because it's the audience who take away these images at the end of the film and then replay them in their minds.
And how much would an audience coming into the cinema to see this, how much would they have known what was going on screen?
I think in the 1960s, for the target audience, it would have been largely unknown. It's not the sort of tale that would have been ordinarily taught within classical studies in schools, for instance. But I think those who were interested would have gone away and done the research and put two and two together and would have more fully understood the nature of the relationship. But I don't think there's a great deal that isn't shown on screen. The two men become very close very fast and very devoted to each other. Of course, there are aspects that, this is moving away from Ray Harryhausen, but I think it's still worth discussing. There are aspects of queer coding in cinema that very often the actors don't know about. For instance, when they were making Ben-Hur, Stephen Boyd and the director were very keen that there should be some suggestion of a gay relationship between Messala and Ben-Hur. But they had to be very sure that Charlton Heston wasn't told anything of this. So it's happening in the director's mind, it's happening in Stephen Boyd's mind, but Charlton Heston's just going through the lines. And that's very, very interesting to see that there are different intentions that are being brought to the film that, as I say, sometimes even the actors themselves are not aware of. So given that we have, with Jason the Argonauts particularly, we have a cast of good old British thespians who will have done the classics, who will have done Shakespeare, who will undoubtedly have had these discussions. I refuse to believe for a second that Nigel Green and John Kearney didn't sit and work out what the relationship was and how far that relationship could go on screen. Because that's what actors do. That's what actors are paid to do, is to work out the internal lives of their characters. And they are internal lives. They don't need to be portrayed on screen. But as I say, with such a very theatrical British cast, I refuse to believe that they hadn't had these discussions. And the same goes for Lawrence Naismith in his little Perizoma.
I love that you're turning this into a thing. There is a pair coming up, Perizoma, and it's on a monster that you would like to talk about, because it also helps us understand some of the queer coding that's going on in Ray Harryhausen films as well.
He has a very, very tiny perizoma, just covering what's necessary. But there are a couple of moments within the film which, looking at it with a queer eye, that you think, are they really going to do this? Because we know from the outset, Ray Harryhausen had done some pre-production sketches of Talos standing there straddling the island with the ship having to pass between his legs. And we see this in the final film. And there are some shots up the legs, up to the perizoma, word of the day, I fear. And I think this is very interesting, because it's more than just terror of a monster who is going to kill you. There's also a degree of the fact that this ship full of men are having to pass between the thighs of this monstrous creature. There's a sort of queer terror there. The other creature that we have, which is a Harryhausen special effect, but really isn't a creature in its own right, is when Triton comes out of the water, and he's an old man with a fish tail and a crown, and he holds the clashing rocks apart. So the idea of these slightly monstrous, dominating older men, I think, is something that runs throughout the Harryhausen films. Again, one wonders how much at the forefront of the filmmaker's minds it is, and how much it's subliminal. But maybe there's a degree to which, if you're presenting these masculine figures as very beautiful and young and barely clothed, you also have to present those masculine figures as being monstrous and domineering and terrifying, so that you get some sort of balance and it doesn't go one way too much.
Well, maybe it's time now to talk about the actor who you mentioned earlier, who was gay, who was a lead man for Ray Harryhausen.
Kerwin Matthews, who was Ray Harryhausen's first Sinbad, was himself a gay man. And he came to the UK to do a great deal of work. He made a number of Hammer films in the early 60s. And whilst he was here, he met his life partner, Tom Nichol, who was quite senior in the firm Harvey Nichols. And he became his life partner for the next 46 years. It was known within the film industry, but of course not by the audience. And I think it was one of the reasons that he was happier to be making smaller Hammer films in the UK than trying to deal with a career back in the US. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why he decided to leave filmmaking altogether when they returned to the US. And like a lot of former actors, he decided to become an antique dealer instead.
Well, I guess, John, to wrap up, the Ray Harryhausen films, do they stand the test of time? Do they hold up today?
I'd like to think we look at them as products of their time. Some of them hold up rather better than others. The special effects always hold up. There's never a problem with the special effects or with the production design. The production design is always faultless. I suppose as a child growing up, I was always fascinated by monsters, and still to a degree am. Doctor Who remains a lifelong passion. So do Hammer films. And in some respects, Ray Harryhausen's work sort of straddles both Doctor Who and Hammer. He was creating creatures, monsters, ideas that neither Doctor Who nor Hammer, with one exception, 1 million years BC, could ever afford to emulate. So he was creating these fabulous creatures, but also creating entirely different stories. He was fulfilling an important gap in my cinematic knowledge and in my growing up as someone who loved cinema and loved monsters and loved seeing beautiful men doing exciting things on screen.